Dr. Jessie Hawkins is an integrative clinical researcher, the executive director of both the Franklin School of Integrative Health and the nonprofit Franklin Health Research Foundation. She also serves as our NAHA regional director for Tennessee. Dr. Hawkins combines her expertise as an aromatherapist and an herbalist with her scientific training to conduct clinical trials and other scientific studies on the healing benefits of essential oils. She will be presenting on the results of the study evaluating lavender and tea tree oils as potential endocrine disruptors. Dr. Hawkins holds a bachelor degree in environmental health, a master's degree in health promotion, a postgraduate certificate in epidemiology, and a PhD in health research. As you can imagine, she is one smart woman with a passion to help others make a difference. In addition to holding numerous certifications in a range of natural health fields, including aromatherapy, aromatic medicine, herbalism, childbirth education, labor support, and more, she travels regularly to conferences and workshops to ensure that the programs at the Franklin School of Integrative Health Sciences offer the most up-to-date education available. She has written over a dozen books on various topics of natural health and has taught tens of thousands of individuals worldwide how to live healthier lives through the use of herbs and essential oils. Let's give a warm, aromatic welcome to Dr. Jessie Hawkins.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here at the NAHA conference. Of course, as you know, NAHA is very near and dear to my heart, and it is an incredible honor to be here. Before we get started, I really want to take this opportunity to thank the conference organizers. I know that organizing a conference with international speakers and an international audience in the midst of a global pandemic is no small feat. And you guys have managed this elegantly and gracefully, and it's been organized and just a really fantastic experience for speakers and I know for all of the participants. So round of applause at home, everyone, for all of our organizers who have worked diligently through this pandemic to make this event happen, even as you are joining me in my own home and not in Salt Lake at the conference center. They have still managed to make this an event that is enjoyable, that is beneficial, that has the interaction and all of the other activities that we look forward to when we're there together. And then, of course, I do look forward to seeing all of you in 2 years when everything is kind of slowed down a little bit, returned to some normalcy, and we are in person again. But this was just fantastic that they were able to make this happen for all of us. So thank you for that. I've also had the luxury of being able to take a peek at some of the other presentations that all of you are enjoying as we go through this amazing conference. And there's so much exciting information that I know you have been catching and tuning into. Exciting research findings, exciting applications, all of that fun stuff. I have the responsibility of going over something that might not be as exciting as some of the other topics, but is definitely an incredibly important scientific topic that we have in any field, but especially an integrative health field where we pride ourselves on safety and making sure that our recommendations are in line with the science. This is a topic or an approach where really we are kind of putting our money where our mouth is, if you will, figuratively and literally for many of us, looking at essential oils and the concerns that have been raised, starting all the way back in 2007, but that are still being raised, still being discussed, still being publicized about the potential for these oils, for our oils, so all of our oils that we use and we work with, to be used or to act as endocrine disruptors, particularly in our children. And this is, of course, a critical topic that we evaluate because child health and child safety is, of course, so important. So many of us are parents. So many of us work with children. I know that we all place a strong emphasis on making sure that our oils are safe for children. And this research really fills in a gap that has been just missing, this information that we haven't had in the literature for quite a while. So I want to first kind of take you all the way back to 2007, where all this started. I know that for many of you, you've been on this journey with us, since 2007. You recall when this first happened. You're not at all unfamiliar with this, but many others might be newer to the field or newer to this particular topic. And so I want to just make sure we're all working from the same foundation and the same level playing ground as we look at what we have done in partnership with NAHA to address this problem, to fill this gap in knowledge. So the first thing that happened was in 2007, a group of researchers published this article called Prepubertal Gynecomastia is Linked to Lavender and Tea Tree Oils. Really provocative title, pretty certain of what they have found. And basically what this manuscript contained was a couple of case studies, just a couple of observations from some pediatric endocrinologists that evaluated children who had prepubertal gynecomastia, little boys who had grown breasts when they were prepubertal. So what that essentially means is it is pretty common during infancy, during periods of puberty, anytime the hormones are kind of going a little bit wonky, then it's not at all uncommon for little boys to have breast buds or for grown men to have breast buds. It's just something that kind of comes and goes during hormonal shifts, things, where things are changing in the body. We expect that. But during more calm periods of the kind of hormonal lifespan, if you will, prepubertal stage. So after they've already sort of balanced out from being born, they're not yet in the pubertal stage, things are just kind of calm and steady. That's not when we would typically expect to see breast buds in boys. We don't expect to see any sort of hormonal activity or behavior or responses in children. And so that's unusual. It's really unusual. It's really rare. So the claim here is, based on these couple of observations, that these children were using lavender and tea tree essential oil products. They grew breast buds, and then they stopped using them, and the breast buds went away. So the researchers then took that information into a lab and evaluated these essential oils in a lab, looking at whether or not they have the potential to act as endocrine disruptors. And they concluded that they do. So as you can imagine, this kind of took the world by storm. These ingredients, lavender, and tea tree, these are ubiquitous in pediatric care products. These are things that, especially lavender, we all recommend for use with children. And now we're seeing that it might cause breast buds in little boys who didn't otherwise have them. You can imagine the media heyday with that sort of headline. And a lot of people took issue with the science. A lot of people. There were a lot of rebuttals, a lot of attention. This was a debate for a while. Behind the scenes, however, other clinicians and other chemists kind of picked up on this and built upon it. So in 2012, we had a pediatrician publish, at least this one's a little bit more accurate of a headline, the possible link between lavender and tea tree and gynecomastia. In 2016, we had another series of cases published. This one specific to chronic lavender exposure, and this one was also specific to Hispanic boys, particularly in South Florida. And they had been using a traditional cologne that contained chemicals from lavender essential oil. There's also in 2018 additional information that was published. This one was looking at some of the hormonal actions of these essential oils, looking particularly in laboratory settings. And then what was really disruptive was in 2019, then there were two new allegations. So the science was kind of building, and every time this happened, it hit more and more headlines. In 2019, though, the whole thing really took off again. The newest allegations were, not only is this causing prepubertal gynecomastia in little boys, this is causing endocrine disruption across the board. This is causing precocious puberty. This is causing, just all sorts of endocrine disruption issues, that basically these oils should not be used with children. And it also began expanding the application out, looking beyond just basic, personal care product, topical application. Now we're talking just smelling the essential oil in a classroom is sufficient to cause this. So massive expansion of these claims within that 2019 research. And so what happened as a result of all of this is that organizations, the Environmental Working Group, Wikipedia, every single organization that makes its money by creating a website on the internet and telling people what they should do about their health, has updated their recommendations. They are all recommending avoidance of lavender essential oil and tea tree essential oil with children, based on what appears to be a whole lot of studies in the literature showing that these essential oils are dangerous. And then what we have here is we have kind of this outgrowth of concern and fear. What is going on with these essential oils? Are they safe? Are they unsafe? Can we use them with children? Should we not use them with children? What is going on? And the problem here is, if we go back to this research, if we go back and look at, this list of studies that we've seen published, we have a lot of case reports and we have a lot of laboratory research. But in the very earliest study, that first 2007 study, there's a quote in there, and I have this in your handout for you. There's a quote in there that is really important and really gets overlooked a lot. Until epidemiologic studies are performed to determine the prevalence of gynecomastia associated with exposure to lavender and tea tree oil, we suggest the medical community should be aware of the possibility. And this sentence has actually gotten a lot of scrutiny. A lot of people have been upset at this sentence, that this warning has gone out. The important thing here, though, is that that's actually what should happen. We should, when we see a couple of cases and it appears that there's an association here, what we should do is take it to the next step scientifically. It's not necessarily accurate to dismiss it out of hand, even though we have widespread use of these essential oils and it doesn't sound plausible to us. Dismissing it out of hand is not a behavior that we want to encourage, and it's certainly not one that we would accept from pharmaceutical companies or over-the-counter drug companies. We expect them to check out claims, even if they don't sound plausible. And number two, it helps us to have a better understanding of how these oils work and what is going on. So the scientific response here, way back in 2007, should have been, let's find out what's going on. Let's dig deeper. What is happening here? And the problem is that hasn't happened. And it's important that we take that further versus looking at these case studies or these lab studies. I know a lot of people responded to that first research in 2007 with lab studies. And we've got this lab study says they don't have the potential to disrupt endocrine systems. This one says they do, and back and forth. And so we've got all this conflicting evidence in the lab. But the claim was it's causing endocrine disruption in children. And when we're talking about something in children, or really in any human being, but especially when our population is as important as a growing child, we don't just keep going back and forth in the lab. That's not the solution there. The solution there is to use established scientific research and find out what is happening with these children. And the approach that we take here is actually through an established set of criteria. And the purpose here is we want to evaluate the potential for causation, because it really doesn't matter if their lab studies were correct and accurate or not. It doesn't matter if these oils are endocrine disruptors in a petri dish. That's not relevant. What's relevant is, what are these essential oils doing when you put them on your child's body? Because it doesn't really matter what happens in a controlled petri dish in a controlled scientific lab. What matters is what happens to the children in your home, or to the children in your neighbor's home, or to the children in your clients' or your patient's home. What is going to happen to them? What can you expect as a professional, as an essential oil enthusiast, to take place after you use one of these essential oils. It doesn't matter if you're treating lice with tea tree oil or anxiety with lavender. It doesn't matter what it is that you're doing. What matters is what is the outcome that we can expect in these actual children, not in petri dishes, in these human beings in front of us. That's what matters. And the way that we establish that is through a series of criteria that we use in epidemiology for this exact purpose all the time. When we have questions such as, is smoking associated with lung cancer? A decades-old question that we've established for clarity. Or, does BPA act as a hormone disruptor? All of these things. Is this water toxicant associated with infertility? All of these questions we have in environmental health, they use the same exact process. We look at what's going on in human beings and we try and gather together the evidence to see if this is an association that is caused by something else or if this is actually a causal relationship. Because even if all those case studies were correct and all those lab studies were correct, that still doesn't establish a causal relationship. So quickly, I want to kind of run through what that looks like from a scientist perspective. So when I, as a scientist, a trained epidemiologist here, I think that this has caused that, whether it's this essential oil has caused breast buds in boys or this chemical in the environment has caused cancer, whatever it is, these criterion are where my head goes. This is what my brain was trained to do, where it was trained to go. The first one we look at is temporality, timelines. The exposure has to come before the outcome. And this can be difficult, especially when the exposure takes a while to produce the outcome. There are a lot of scenarios where that's not actually taking place. It just appears to be. So you really have to confirm that the exposure is happening before the outcome. The next thing you want to do is quantify the strength of a relationship. So first you have to establish that a relationship exists, and then we want to quantify it. How strong is this association? Because if it's a weak association, it's less likely to be causal. There's not a benchmark. If your odds ratio is this or your relative risk is this, then it's definitely causal. It's not quantified in that way. But this just is pieces of the puzzle, pieces of that evidence that we need. Stronger associations are, of course, more likely to be causal. They are more powerful. They're weighted heavier in terms of total evidence. The next one is consistency. We want to see it happen time and time again. If this causes that, we should be able to replicate that every single time. If I put my foot on the gas in my car goes fast. Every time I hop into it, unless something's wrong, I'm able to reproduce that phenomenon. If this is causing that, we should see reproducibility, which is a core of scientific research. We should see it happening time and time again. The next one is biological gradient. This goes back to the ancient understanding that the dose makes the poison. Higher doses will typically produce a larger response. Now, of course, these are guidelines. These are not, again, hard and fast rules. There are things, of course, where, there is no safe exposure level. But typically what we will see is a bigger dose produces a bigger response. And what that would look like here is boys with more exposure to lavender oil would grow larger breast buds. That's what we should expect to see there. That sort of biological gradient. More of this equals more of the response. The next one is specificity. So here what we're looking for is how certain we are that it's this substance versus this with that, and potentially that on Tuesdays if you're standing on one leg. Then that may happen. The more complex it gets, the more difficult it is to establish causation, and the more you're going to need other types of evidence to kind of bring in there and put together. And then we get to just some logic components. Coherence. Is this consistent with what we know to be true? Does this kind of turn everything else that we understand about this substance or about this exposure on its head. And again, that's not to say it can't happen. Sometimes we do have those scientific breakthroughs that turn everything on its head, and we have to go back and relearn and restudy some things. But for the most part, the vast, overwhelming majority of scientific research, findings are going to be consistent with what we already know to be true. And so we can look at, does this match what we know about these chemicals? Does this match other actions of these essential oils? Does this match what other essential oils are doing? Is this consistent with all the facts that we already know exist? Then we should see an experiment. And this is just when we take the exposure away, does the outcome go away or is it reduced? And of course, again, this is going to be something that's got to be adaptable to the situation. If we're talking about a carcinogen, taking away the carcinogen, unfortunately, does not take away the cancer. But when we're talking about things that are relatively straightforward, such as, the claim here is it produces prepubertal gynecomastia in boys. If you take that exposure away, then we should expect that to dissipate. We should see it go away. And then finally, we're just looking at analogies. Do similar exposures produce similar outcomes? And those are all the questions that we seek to answer. And we kind of put that together to look at the entirety of the body of evidence. And then we have tests that we can run to see if something is in fact a causal association, or if there's just, something that appears to be that way. If this is just what it kind of looks like, but it's not necessarily a causal association. So when we look at the evidence produced in the lab, the only thing we may have, and an emphasis on may have, is biological plausibility. Biological plausibility is where we have that conflicting evidence in the lab that indicates maybe there is some endocrine disruption here. We haven't really fully satisfied that criterion, but if we're being generous, we can say there might be some evidence here that establishes that. Otherwise, we don't have any of that. None of that has actually been evaluated scientifically. And the way that we evaluate that is going all the way back to that 2007 call to action. We need epidemiological studies. And that link, despite being accepted in Wikipedia and Environmental Working Group and WebMD and every other place you go for information on the internet, despite being replicated, despite being incorporated into pediatrician guidelines and accepted as reality, it has actually never been evaluated in epidemiological studies. Not one epidemiological study has actually looked at this claim, has actually looked at this association, has actually looked in real human children to either confirm or reject the claim until now. That's what we've actually been working on for the last couple of years, and that's what I'm going to be going over with you today. Wherever it is that you are joining us from in the world today, this afternoon, this evening, whatever it is that this morning, whatever that looks like, that's what we're going to be talking about. So the project that we put together to address this problem, we call it the APICS project, and it's the Aromatic Plant Ingredient and Child Health Study. And the purpose of that was that we can apply this basically wherever the claims are going. We can look at lavender and tea tree right now, and we can look at other essential oils or other health-related outcomes in children. So this is an ongoing project that we have, but the first step that we undertook or tackled in this project is looking at this lavender and tea tree and endocrine disruption claim. And so there are 5 steps to this approach. The first one is a background and evidence review. Similar to what I've just done with you, but taking a scientific approach, taking some evaluation instruments that we have, that we know are validated, that we know really help to kind of quantify the totality of evidence, and looking at the cases that we have that have been put forward as evidence of an association. The next step is measurement development. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but measurement development basically is a key component for an epidemiological study. We cannot do epidemiology if we cannot measure, if we cannot accurately classify and quantify exposures in the human body. The next step, once we can measure and accurately classify people, is to identify prevalence and compare that to population norms. So we're finally looking at addressing that call to action from 2007. So it's an old call to action, but since it hasn't been addressed, it still represents a gap in the literature. And we need to fill that gap with science, not with speculation. Then we want to determine the odds of endocrine disruption between exposed and unexposed children. Are exposed children more likely to have endocrine disruption? Now, keep in mind that if we find they're more likely to have endocrine disruption, that does not mean essential oils caused it. We could have reverse causality. Maybe children who have endocrine disruption are more likely to use these essential oils. Maybe they have endocrine disruption and they change their lifestyle approaches. They change their behaviors and start using more natural options. There's a lot of things that have to happen once we establish an association that will make that kind of move from just a general association correlation, if you will, to actually a causal relationship. But the first thing we have to do is see if a relationship even exists. And we do that by comparing the odds. And then, of course, if a relationship is identified, the next step is to take it further and say, okay, let's look at these other Bradford Hill criteria. Let's look at these other factors. Is this a causal relationship? And if it is a causal relationship, which direction does it go? Are these essential oils causing endocrine disruption? Or are children with endocrine disruption more likely to be using natural products? What is going on here? And before we look at some of the results of this research, because this project has actually been going on for over 2 years now, so we are well underway. We've got some of our early findings. We've got some of our publications out there. I do want to, for the purposes of transparency, but also for the purposes of offering our sincere and deepest thanks for each of these funding partners, I do want to disclose the individuals who have funded this particular research project. Now, this project is something that was undertaken through the Franklin Health Research Foundation, a nonprofit foundation with a mission very similar to NAHA's, and that is building upon the existing scientific knowledge to fill in these gaps in the literature so that we can have better information about essential oils, botanicals, prevention habits, and so on. And so we specifically target these gaps in knowledge so that we can address them, things that are beneficial for the entire community. And the Franklin Health Research Foundation is the nonprofit arm of the for-profit Franklin Health Research Center, which I am the executive director of the research center, and my incredible research team and I work specifically in the natural product industry, everything from epidemiological studies, registry studies, clinical trials, meta-analyses, and so on. And we do receive the majority of our funding comes from the Franklin Health Research Center. That's how we're able to actually accomplish the research that we put out there, that's available out there in the natural health field. This particular project, however, is much larger than the bulk of the projects that we undertake. And research is expensive. I just want to put that out there, just to be brutally honest with everyone. Our researchers work on this project without compensation. This is volunteer work that our researchers do. But to correctly, ethically, and legally conduct scientific research, there are a wide range of ethical authorizations and checks and balances and whatnot that have to take place to make sure it's done legally, to make sure it's done ethically, and to make sure it's recognized scientific research and not a grade school experiment. And paying for all of the sort of research permits, if you will, all of the different checks and balances we have to keep in place to satisfy all of those agencies, even paying for publication in the scientific literature. The authors of a study actually are the ones that pay if you're able to access that for free versus if it's behind a paywall. That comes from the authors of the study. That adds up really quickly. So when we first looked at this project, Annette and I actually were talking about it years ago, and just talking about the size of this project and the amount of funding that would be necessary to make sure that it's done correctly, ethically, and legally. And NAHA has been a really just a driving force behind making this happen. This project would not have happened without NAHA. The organization that all of you are a part of, and of course I'm honored to be a part of as well, is just purely phenomenal when it comes to addressing these gaps in knowledge, addressing the research that needs to take place, and making sure that we take the field of aromatherapy further. So NAHA was instrumental in making this happen. This is truly one of the perks of being a NAHA member, which is also why, with the exception of our funding agencies, you guys are the first to be hearing about these results, because it is NAHA inspired research. The Australian Tea Tree Industry Association also contributed significantly to this work. They, of course, saw the benefit of finding an answer to this question, as did the Tisserand Institute. They also contributed significantly to this work. And many of you who are sitting there listening to these results and listening to what all of this did contributed to the NAHA crowdfunding effort, whether it was a donation of $10 or $500, everything in the middle. Every single penny helped to make sure that we were able to keep all of the kind of ducks in a row, if you will. So again, if we were face to face, sitting in front of each other, I would want to give you a big round of applause, because all of you made this happen. My team contributed the work, and a lot of the overhead expenses, but really the grunt of it was a collaborative global effort to addressing this problem. Everyone really pitched in, saw the importance of this work, and helped us to make sure that it could happen, and that we could make sure that it happened correctly. So this is out there for transparency purposes, because it's important to talk about where research funding comes from. But also, I just really want to publicly commend every single organization that took it upon themselves to really put their money where their mouth is, and every single one of you that did as well, to say, we want a scientific answer to this, not speculation, and we're willing to help make that happen. So thank you so much to all of you who contributed personally and or professionally. So where did all of that go, and what have we accomplished in that 2 years? We'll start with step number 1, the background and evidence review. So the purpose of this, and I've got a quote here for you from University College of London, the purpose of a systematic review is to find as much as possible of the research related to a specific question. So this is not cherry picking. This is not, I'm writing a research paper, I'm going to go in the literature, I already know what I want to say, I want to find what supports me. This is going and harvesting everything you can find on a topic and making sense of it. The methods here have to be explicit, they have to be systematic, and the important factor here is we're getting the totality of the scientific literature. So the evidence review that we conducted for this particular project, the purpose of it was to review the evidence related to this proposed link between lavender and tea tree oil, and look at the potential association for endocrine disruption as a whole, but also specifically for prepubertal gynecomastia. And what we did was we took every single one of the cases we could find in the scientific literature throughout the entire world, every single documented case study we could find, whether it was a case series or an isolated case study, every single thing that we could find that was related to these particular outcomes in the scientific literature, evaluate it, and then quantify the level of evidence that we had with that association. As you might imagine, however, we ran into quite a few problems trying to accomplish this. The first problem that we ran into is that the actual exposure to lavender and tea tree essential oil varied in terms of how well each of these providers confirmed the exposure. We had a few cases where it was very clear that these patients were not at all exposed to lavender and tea tree essential oil. Whatever substance they were using, sometimes it was identified, sometimes it was not. When they removed it, their symptoms went away, which is fantastic, but they weren't actually using these essential oils, so it kind of doesn't matter in terms of the total evidence here regarding aromatherapy. There were also some, however, who not only confirmed exposure, but ran their own lab tests looking for some of these key chemicals in aromatherapy. So it really kind of was across the board in terms of evidence. But what we had overall was an inability to really say these kids that were classified as exposed were exposed. And that's a fundamental flaw in epidemiology for obvious reasons. If you don't have people in the correct exposure group, it really does not matter how flawless your statistical analysis might be. Your results are garbage. I always kind of liken it to if you're baking a cake. If you hand me rotten eggs and mildewy flour, it does not matter if I'm the best chef in the world. I can't make you a good cake out of that. If our exposure status is not accurately classified, none of the rest of it matters. So this is a problem, and we're going to come back to that problem. We also found that how they were evaluating exposure method really varied dramatically. In some cases, there were children using a spray-on cologne for extended periods of time. There was another case where a child just was smelling an essential oil in a classroom, just kind of some passive exposure during the day. Others had a body wash, a wash-off product that they were using. Others had a deodorant. There were a lot of different types of exposure. And what we found was, first of all, we weren't actually able to conduct a quantitative analysis of these cases because the reporting was so poor. They did not provide the correct type of evidence that was necessary to actually conduct further research. So that's a big problem for obvious reasons. But what we were able to conclude based on what we found was, first of all, there's no clinical evidence whatsoever that tea tree essential oil is associated with that exposure. We found that these case studies, however fascinating and interesting they might be, really tell us nothing about whether or not tea tree essential oil is related to these particular outcomes that we're looking at. When it comes to lavender, what we found was that they were failing to actually confirm exposure to lavender. And again, we were not able to really find evidence in the scientific literature, any clinical evidence in the scientific literature that lavender was associated either. So background review, kind of not great for people making these claims. But what it really clarified as we're going forward is that we've got to get better at measuring exposure. And that was a huge project for our team to undertake. So step number 2, the next thing that we have here is measurement development. Again, measurement is critical in epidemiology. Measurement is really everything. If you are not able to accurately measure what you're looking at or what you're working on, you're not able to conduct any research. It does not matter how talented you are. It does not matter how smart you are. If you can't measure the variables correctly, you can't do anything. So we had to measure who was exposed to lavender and tea tree essential oil and how much exposure they actually had, which is hard. And it's hard for a couple of reasons. First of all, these essential oils don't leave a detectable trace in the human body. Some of the chemicals in these essential oils have half-lives in the human body, not on the shelf, as short as 14 to 18 minutes. So really, they're not sticking around in the body for an extended period of time, which means I can't come up to you and give you any sort of test that tells me if you were exposed to lavender essential oil 10 years ago. I can't create a test that does that. It's not sticking around in your body. What we found is that the bulk of existing exposure status was simply a kid comes in, they have prepubertal gynecomastia, they see one of these care providers or clinicians who are attempting to link the two, and they're asked, their parents are asked, hey, mom, you're not using any of that lavender stuff, are you? Have you been using lavender? Obviously, these are kind of leading questions depending on who's asking and how you're asking. And there are clearly other issues as well. How many parents, and I know a lot of you are parents, so show of hands, in front of your computers, virtual hands, of how many of you can recite a list of all of the ingredients in your child's personal care products, every single ingredient that you have. And not only just can you do it right now while you're comfortable and you're thinking about it, because we've been talking about it for a while, but let's say you're at the doctor's office You've just found out there's something wrong with your child, and you're trying to figure out what's wrong with your child. You're not thinking clearly. Your child is upset, and now you have to think through all of that. We're not going to get the best answers. They're not going to be the most accurate. This produces what we refer to as bias in the scientific literature. There are a lot of different types of bias in the literature. I know that in everyday terminology, when we talk about bias, we tend to think about things like personal bias. I'm biased against that. I don't like that. And that is definitely a type of bias. But in science, what we're talking about is anything that skews our data, anything that points our data in the wrong direction. And so we have several different types of bias. There are actually dozens of types of bias that we're taught to identify and control for in scientific research. But we have several types of bias here in this particular problem. Information bias. We're not necessarily going to be getting correct information. Interviewer bias. Obviously, the way the question is asked is going to influence what kind of answer we get. Have you been using that lavender stuff? Most products have lavender in it. Have you been using it? You have? Okay. Clearly, there's a lot of different ways you can get the answer you're looking for. So interviewer bias is always a big problem. You really can't just randomly ask people if they're exposed to something. You have to be trained to get that information accurately. Recall bias. I don't know what the ingredients are. I'm stressed. My child's not feeling well. You've just told me my son is actually growing breast buds. I don't know what we're going to do about it. I'm really worried about his well-being. And now you're asking me for an ingredient list of my kid's soap? I don't know. Obviously, we're going to get quite a bit of recall bias there. And ultimately, what all of that produces is misclassification bias. Kids who are not exposed being considered exposed, kids who are exposed being considered not exposed. And when you don't correctly identify and classify your patients as exposed or unexposed, what happens is your findings are nonsense. They're garbage because you haven't correctly put your individual data points in the right group. And when they're all mixed up and muddied together, what we call that is differential misclassification. And basically what that means is that when we are overclassifying exposed cases, when we're asking these leading questions, when we're, getting more people who are exposed and popping them into that group, whether or not they belong into that group, then what happens is we have an artificially inflated sense of risk. Technically, what happens is it biases our rate ratios or our risk ratios or odds ratios, whatever it is that we're using here, away from the null. It makes them look bigger than it is. It makes things look scarier than they are. And if that's not what we see happening when we look at the scientific literature here. So the purpose of this study number 2, was to fix this problem. We've got to figure out a way to accurately classify these kids as exposed or unexposed. And of course, there's a scientific way of doing that. You can measure just about anything with science if you know how to develop measurement instruments and to validate them. And so that's what we did. So we developed the Aromatic Plant Ingredient and Child Health Survey as part of the Aromatic Plant Ingredient and Child Health Study. And then we tested it for validity and for reliability as a measurement instrument to find out how many times it produces a false positive, how many times it produces a false negative, and also whether or not we can quantify the amount of exposure. Because if you go back to how we established a relationship, we need to look at a dose-response relationship. So we need to quantify exposure and we need to accurately classify yes or no exposure. So there's 2 different ways that we need to be measuring exposure here. And that's what we did while we were at it. We also figured, let's go ahead and quantify the accuracy or lack thereof for the existing approach so that we can directly compare them head to head. So we can say, this is how we're measuring. This is how they've been measuring, and one's clearly better than the other. And so that's what we did here. So when we're looking at classifying exposed versus unexposed, then there's a number of ways that we do that. We look at sensitivity and specificity, which basically tells us about our false positives and our false negatives. We look at positive predictive value and negative predictive value. How well are we predicting these? And we looked at how well the model correctly classifies participants. With the approach we developed, Our model correctly classified almost 98% of participants. Just a couple of hundredths of a percentage point shy of that, 97.96% of participants. That's pretty good. You're never going to get 100% of participants accurately classified. That's not realistic. There are always going to be some that fall through, and we account for that in statistical analysis. But you do want to get as good as you can, as close as you can. And 97.96 is really good. It's incredibly good. In our particular evaluation of this tool, we had a 0% false negative rate and a 2.78% false positive rate. So we got really, really good at accurately classifying each of these kids. This was a lot better than the current approach. What was currently happening produced sensitivity and specificity far below what we had and was only correctly classifying just under 80% of the patients. So a full 1 in 5 patients who came through one of these clinics and was being classified with this approach was misclassified. You really can't come to any reasonable conclusions when 20% of your classifications are wrong. And it's likely higher than that because we were not replicating it in an environment where parents are already stressed with leading interviewer questions. So there's a significant potential here that theirs is actually going to score even lower than what we were able to replicate when we were evaluating their approach. The next thing we did was evaluate dose response. How close are we going to get? How accurate can we get with dose response? And what we got here was a mean difference in exposures of 0.265 products. So about a quarter of a product off in terms of quantifying the number of exposures that they had. About a fourth of an exposure was our kind of variation, with limits of agreement ranging from negative 3.1 to 3.7, which is a reasonable range that you would expect here for dose response. So what that indicates is that we can accurately classify kids as exposed, unexposed really well. And we can also accurately identify their dose pretty well. And that is, of course, exactly what we need in order to be able to go on and actually answer this research question. So I know it's a whole bunch of presumably boring science, if you will. It's not the most exciting thing. I know you're probably thinking, okay, get to it. Is there an association or not? But this is really important foundational science because what we've established is, first of all, the type of evidence they're putting together when they make these claims is really poor. Second of all, they're not accurately classifying patients. About 1 in 5, probably higher, are misclassified. And we are able to classify patients. These are critical foundational elements when we're evaluating the quality of evidence or the weight of evidence. These are really important factors. So these steps, even though I know that when you're really just wanting the answer is yes, no, what's going on? These are critical components to establishing what can we believe, who's right, because we can put this information out there and say, no, there's no information. But really, when we're talking about children, we cannot have any room for error. And so that leads people to ask the question, well, how do I know who's right? Is your study said there's not, their study says there is. Better safe than sorry. I think I'll still avoid it. We've really got to get this perfect. It's got to be right. We've got to know that we're measuring correctly, that we're doing all of this correctly. And so that's why I'm walking you through each of these stages as meticulous as they are, so that you can really see the weight of the evidence when you see conflicting information out there, so you can have certainty with what it is you're interpreting, what it is you're trusting, and what the science actually says without having to put blind faith in anybody. So what we found here with this particular study is that currently the current approach leads to misclassification. And if your patients are misclassified, again, you're baking cakes with rotten eggs. You've got mildewy flour. It's not putting out anything good. If you don't have your people in the correct classification category, it doesn't matter. The rest of it doesn't matter because your people were not, you're exposed or not exposed, and you're unexposed or not unexposed. And that's a huge, huge deal. The second thing that we found is that we can measure, we can classify correctly. And that's also a huge deal because this far exceeds what you would expect from a measurement instrument. So now that we can measure everyone correctly, now that we know the current approach is wrong, we've developed an approach that works, that we have demonstrated works, now we can meet that call to action from 2007 and identify prevalence. So what we did here is a massive cross-sectional study across the US, looking at children aged 2 to 15 across the entire US and accurately classifying them, yes, no, exposed, unexposed, and then for those who were exposed, quantifying the size of their exposure. Were you exposed a lot or were you exposed a little, so that we can look at a dose-response relationship. And we do this for a couple of reasons. So we've talked about the Bradford-Hill criteria, and that's kind of the big in-depth approach that we take. But what that does is it puts together a pile of evidence for us. If we want to establish causation, 3 things absolutely must be there. And these are literal criteria, not guidelines like the Bradford-Hill. The first one is covariation. In other words, is there a correlation? We've all heard correlation does not equal causation, and that's true, but correlation is part of the evidence needed for causation. If it's going to be a causal relationship, there's got to be a relationship. Temporal precedence, which again, exposure has to come before the outcome. That one's non-negotiable. That has to be there. There are no exceptions for that. And then finally, non-spuriousness. We've got to make sure that these are not just random coincidences. We've got to rule out all the other factors that we possibly can. Not one of those has been met. And so the first thing we're going to do is address that very first one of covariation. Is there a relationship here? So we're going to look at prevalence, and we're going to look at what we know prevalence is across a population average, and then we're going to compare the two. So before we do, just a little bit of Epi 101. When we talk about prevalence, we're talking about total cases in a population, not just new cases, but we're looking for lifetime prevalence. So how many of these kids have experienced this outcome, whether or not it's a new case, whatever that might be, how many of them have had this outcome? And that's what we're evaluating there. So this particular study, the cross-sectional study, is where we really are getting into our human participants. We had hundreds of kids in this study, and we're really looking specifically at exposure, not exposure, quantity of exposure, and did they develop these outcomes, and was it in a greater quantity than the general public develops the outcomes. So we'll start with the obvious. Prepubertal gynecomastia. We didn't find a single case. In fact, our team has had a really difficult time finding all of these kids out there with prepubertal gynecomastia. And one of the reasons for that is it's extremely rare. It is a very, very rare outcome. We don't see it a lot. Essential oils are not extremely rare, however. But if essential oils were causing prepubertal gynecomastia at the rates that are being claimed, we should not have such a difficult time finding all these cases. They should be all over the place. Every pediatrician participating in this project should be able to identify dozens, if not hundreds, of kids that they can send our way. And they're not able to do that. We didn't find a single case. We did find a couple of cases of precocious puberty. And so we evaluated the prevalence of precocious puberty in these children who are using lavender and tea tree essential oils that we are certain were exposed, not that we're speculating. And we compared those statistically with population norms. What do we expect to have happen, among regular kids in the US? And statistically, they were the same. So we look at delayed puberty. What's going on here? We found some cases of delayed puberty. Statistically, we compared those to the public at large. They were the same. No increase. Okay, so let's look at other endocrine disruption outcomes, growth hormone deficiency. So we looked at growth hormone deficiency, children in our population in our cross-sectional study who had been exposed, that we were certain had been exposed, and the general public. No difference. So we looked at hypothyroidism. Again, we are trying to thoroughly exhaust this research question. We are digging deep. That's fine. We didn't find prepubertal gynecomastia, but you said they were endocrine disruptors. So let's look for all of it, any sort of endocrine disorder in children that we can find. So we looked at hypothyroidism. We statistically compared it to the general population. You already know the answer. There was no difference. They were the same. So then we grouped them all together. Okay, let's look at every type of potential endocrine disorder we can find, put them all together. What is the odds ratio or the risk among those who were exposed and those who were unexposed? We put together a risk ratio for this particular analysis, and the risk ratio confidence interval was really wide because there weren't a lot of children who have these disorders, and included one, which means they're basically the same. Children who are exposed to lavender and tea tree essential oils experience the same rate of endocrine disruption as children who are not exposed to these essential oils. Something else is responsible here because there is no relationship. There is no difference. So let's take it even further. So let's look at that dose response approach. Let's look at the odds of endocrine disruption. We would expect to see that as your exposure goes up, your odds become greater that you're going to experience any form of endocrine disruption, not just prepubertal gynecomastia. We looked across the board. Any endocrine related disorder that could take place. Your odds should increase as your exposure increases. Our odds ratio here was a lot closer for this particular analysis just because the type of analysis that we ran here. Our confidence interval here was a lot smaller. It was nice and tight and clean, just like you want to see. And what we saw here was the odds ratio was 1.001. Basically, it was the exact same. The odds were 1-to-1. Kids who were using these essential oils, kids who were not using these essential oils, when we put in control variables such as race, age, some of these other factors that we know are associated with these outcomes, we know that race is associated with your risk of developing endocrine disorders. We know some of these other things are present. When we look at all of that, the odds are essentially the same. There's no difference in endocrine-related outcomes, endocrine disorders, among children who are using these oils and children who are not using these oils. We turned these data upside down, inside out, every which way you could possibly look for an association. We looked at dose response. We looked at, just yes, no exposure status. We looked at each individual disorder. We looked at all the disorders together. We couldn't find any differences between kids using these essential oil-based products and kids who were not using these essential oil-based products. So let's go back to those Bradford Hill criteria. Now that we have the first ever epidemiological study conducted on this topic, what do we have? What does the evidence say? Because we finally have some epidemiological evidence that we can evaluate. So let's go at temporality. Obviously, we weren't able to establish that because there wasn't a relationship. So we didn't have to figure out what direction that relationship goes in. There wasn't one. Strength of the relationship. Odds ratio was right at 1.0. If there's a relationship, if we find one, if we keep digging and we are able to unearth something, it's incredibly small because we had a perfectly powered sample, everything done here by the book. And odds ratio was 1.0. And it was a very good, clean, tight odds ratio. Everything was what you would want to see. Consistency. Nope, we did not have consistency. We were not able to replicate the claims in any of these case reports or case series. We tried, tried to replicate it, and we're not able to replicate it. Biological gradient, dose response. We did the dose response analysis. We evaluated it. No association was identified. So let's look at specificity. What do we see here for specificity? It's not present. when we isolate these essential oils. Now, because keep in mind, when we're talking about case studies, and this is the biggest flaw of a case study, when you want to see something improve, when I have a condition or you have a condition and we go to our care provider, whoever that might be, and we say, my boy's growing breast buds, or this is happening, or that is happening, and they prescribe something or make a recommendation. We do that usually, but we do other things too, don't we? If my son is growing breasts and he's not at a pubertal stage where you expect to see that happen, and the doctor says, stop using the soap you're using. Okay, I might stop using the soap I'm using, but you can bet I'm on Dr. Google looking at soy, looking at all of these other factors, and we're dropping a lot from our diet. When we isolate all of that out, when none of those factors are playing a role and we only look at the essential oils, which is something only epi research can do, we don't have an association. So specificity isn't there. If anything is happening, it's going to be some combination of essential oils with something else, something that is potentiating that effect, or synergy, as we would call it in aromatherapy, something else that is playing a role there. The specificity is just not there. Coherence. We've already known this. As aromatherapists, we knew this. A causal relationship is not consistent with our current knowledge. This is not something we have already seen or recognized. It's not something that's in the scientific literature. Studies that use these essential oils have not come across any sort of problem. In fact, we have studies evaluating some of these essential oils with birth control and found no interactions. So if there's some sort of hormonal something going on here, we would be seeing it in cases other than just breast buds in little boys. We would be seeing all sorts of endocrine disruption related outcomes, not just in children, but also in adults. And we're not seeing consistency there. So the coherence criterion is not met. If we remove the exposure, does the outcome dissipate? Well, we're not able to do that because we don't have the outcome. We weren't able to find any of the outcome. So the outcome's not there to try and eliminate. And then finally, looking at analogy, we don't have any similarities here. We don't have really essential oils that we know to contain. First of all, we don't have any that we know to contain hormones. That's not how essential oils work. But we really don't have any that we can say, this is chemically very similar, and it definitely, has this effect in the human body. We don't have similar exposures that are producing endocrine disruption. So at the end of the day, we are not meeting those criteria, any of them. When we put the whole body of evidence together, we come up with a whole bunch of nothing. But it's important to do, because when we have those case reports, when we have those claims, we need to know. We need to know with certainty. We need to look at these, speculated case reports and say, okay, these children developed breast buds and they may or may not have been using these products. We found that classification is not reliable. And then when they quit using them and presumably engaged in other lifestyle behaviors, practices, then the breast buds went away. Was that a coincidence? Did any of their behavioral changes result in the breast buds going away? And specifically, did the removal of these essential oils? It's important that we know, that we don't speculate, that we know. And it's important that we replicate these findings. So our team is not finished. All of the information that I've been talking to you about today is either published in the scientific literature or is in the peer review process. So you'll be able to see it soon. But again, replication is key. Just because we conducted a whole cross-sectional study and did not find any relationship at all doesn't guarantee with complete certainty. So we're continuing on. We are conducting phase 2. And then, of course, we're going to keep digging. We're going to keep digging. We're going to keep trying to unearth a relationship. If we do find one, we will follow it and look at whether or not it's a causal relationship. We're not able to engage in any of that more in-depth research because there's not a relationship to evaluate. We haven't found one. And then if we're able to replicate these findings, then of course those will be published, as whatever it is that we find will be published. And then we'll be able to really have the certainty that we want. We want to replicate it and make sure, we don't see an association. We tried again. We didn't find an association. Okay, there's not one. So that is all continuing. If you work with pediatric populations, if you are a pediatrician or a pediatric provider and would like to get involved in this project, it is still ongoing. We would love to partner with you and sort of speed this along. It hit a little bit of a time delay with the pandemic that we all have been experiencing. A lot of people's research focuses, including our teams, went to more pressing issues. But we are collaborating with that, and of course with other research. We work with incredible organizations all over the world, and you can also keep up with the research. The scientific committee is regularly delivering updates on this project and other projects that NAHA is involved with, or the Franklin Health Research Foundation is involved with, through NAHA continuing ed webinars, newsletters, and so on. NAHA membership, of course, is a great perk to have there. That gets you access to all of that. And then, of course, you can find our work at franklinhealth.org for the updates that we are delivering and providing there as well. So thank you so much for joining me as we dig into this, again, not necessarily as exciting, but definitely important, valuable research that we need to conduct and that we need to continue conducting in our field. And I look forward to everyone's questions and answers here in a bit.